right. Well, good evening. Hope everybody's doing all right. You can go ahead and turn to chapter 13 of Nehemiah. We'll finish it up tonight. And I'll say it here and then say it at the end. If you have stuff that you feel like we maybe went too fast, or stuff that you have questions about that wasn't covered, that's a lot of what we're going to do next week is try to just review everything that we've read through, stuff we've looked at, and I would love your input on things you would like to have answered, because I know in a setting like this, most especially the auditorium, that we don't get opportunity to have great discussion. I'll just put it that way. So if you have stuff, y'all send it, text it, leave a sticky note in my office back there, whatever you need, however you want, and we'll try to cover that. Family news and notes is in the back, and hopefully you got it via email. The only thing that wasn't via email is the schedule for the summer series that's coming up. And so that's going to be, it's on the website actually. If you go to our website, you click summer series, you can see the whole schedule of who's preaching, when they're preaching, what they're talking about, all those things. All right, any announcements, anything we need to be mindful of since we last met on Sunday? All right, well, let's start with a word of prayer, and then we'll get into Nehemiah chapter 13. Almighty God, we just thank you so much, as always. The very idea that the creator of all things stops and listens to us is just an unbelievable thing, that we get to talk to you, that you've given us this avenue of prayer. We thank you for it. And Lord, we pray that we're the kind of people that use this avenue, that use this gift that you've given us more often than we do, to cast all our anxieties on you and give you praise and give you thanks through it all. Lord, as we get to the end of our study here in this great book of Nehemiah, we thank you for it and all the application that we've been able to make. And we just pray that our study and the things we're learning and reading are drawing us closer and closer to you. Lord, we love you. We thank you and pray that you bless our time here together tonight. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right. So Nehemiah chapter 13. Last week, just real quick, we spent our time running through chapter 11 and chapter 12, and for the most part, the bulk of our time was spent in Nehemiah chapter 11 in the first two verses, and then also in chapter 12 in verse 43. But really, a lot of what we talked about last week was this point that they get to in chapter 11. The walls are rebuilt, things are going great, but now it's time to repopulate the city. So in chapter 11, 1 and 2, we had the leaders. Remember, we talked about them. They move into the city. Then what did you have after that? Who went next into the city? Or do you remember how all that went down? Okay, so 1 out of every 10 then went in. Talked about that in the context of, I guess really our vocab today would be like a lottery system, so to speak. And then who went? The volunteers, right? And that was where we spent a lot of our time, were those, we called them willing unknowns. They're not listed, they're not named, and yet super important that they did what they did. Now, why is this important? Well, if you'll remember, we went back to chapter 7 and we read about the condition of the city. Why did the city need people? Well, what did we learn from chapter 7? What was the condition really of the city, even with the finished walls? Okay, desolate. What, Andrew? Okay, it was run down. Yeah, it was kind of abandoned for the most part. And so we talked about how, you can build what you want to build. But a city is not a city unless it has what? People. It's got to have people. So that's what they're doing there. And then the rest of chapter 11 deals with those who are living in Jerusalem. A lot of names in verses 3 through 19. Then the rest of it is really the people that are living outside of the city. And then chapter 12, we skip through the names of those who came up with Zerubbabel, all important, and don't mean to bypass them or skip over them. Those things are all important, but really a lot of our focus was verse 27 through the end of the chapter, and I gave you the visual on the screen of the wall, and really how what we were reading was they broke off in two directions, and then they got to the house of God, and what did they do once they got there in dedication of this wall? And actually, this one should be hot on your mind because I just talked about it Sunday too. Okay, this big celebration. They're rejoicing, and God had given them great joy. And chapter 12 and verse 43, just an awesome verse. If you weren't here last week, that would be one to highlight. Their joy is heard from afar. So now chapter 13, we got a lot to unpack here. And actually, we're not going to start in verse 1. We're going to start in verse 6. Because what we learn here right at the beginning, well, not at the beginning, in verse 6, is that Nehemiah says, while all of this was taking place, Nehemiah, was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king. And after some time, I asked leave of the king. So, if you remember all the way back when we first began, what was one of the conditions of Nehemiah coming to Jerusalem in the first place? Okay, he's got to come back. So if you want to make a note there, if you're taking notes, that's chapter 2 and verse 6. And the king asks Nehemiah, okay, so, when are you going to come back? And we spent a lot of time talking about that because Nehemiah is able to give him a definite time. And so really what we're going to read here is that Nehemiah had gone, and he had gone back, and most commentators suggest that he was gone for about 10 to 12 years. So that's kind of a long time. And I think as you take into consideration where all of this began in chapter 2 and verse 1 was in the 20th year of Artaxerxes the king. And so now here we are in the 32nd year. So there's no way to pinpoint exactly, I don't care who suggests what, there's no way to pinpoint exactly how long he was gone, I don't think. But a lot of what we've read so far is kind of hard to pinpoint how long this time period is, because what we've heard a lot of is days, right? That's been the timeline of most things. Like what, for instance? Okay, so the number of days it took to rebuild the wall. So quick trivia, how many days was that? 52. What else happened over a matter of days? Remember when Nehemiah first got there, what did he do for days? Yeah, so he was checking things out for 3 days, right? So a lot of what we have is in the context of days, and now, again, all that to say, it's hard to kind of figure out how long he was gone, but he was gone. And what we're about to read as we finish the book is him leaving for a time, and now he's back. And so let's read beginning verses 1 through 3. It says, on that day, they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people. Well, let me finish. I'll finish this first. And in it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God. Verse 2, for they did not meet the people of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. Yet our God turned the curse into a blessing. As soon as the people heard the law, they separated from Israel all those of foreign descent. Now, so what we got here can be rather confusing based on what we just read in chapter 12. Okay? So the way this could read is that they've just had this dedication and celebration of the wall. Now look back at verse 1 of this chapter. On that day, on what day? The same day that he's talking about in chapter 12? Well, I'm telling you that it's not because of everything else that we're about to read. So I don't want you to be confused in thinking that, they like run together, and especially not by way of time, right? And so what does he find here being done all these years later in these first few verses? I mean, this has got to be nice that he goes away for a time, and now he comes back, and we read these first 3 verses about what they were doing, and what does he find them doing? Guys, that's an easy question. What are they doing? Yeah, they're reading from the book of Moses. Have you seen them do this before? Yeah, all the way back in chapter 8, right? As they start to make things right, and Ezra stands up on this podium that they built just for him, and he's reading the book of the law. Now, what they find written in it is kind of interesting. I think we're left to assume that this is something that, for the most part, they didn't know or had not heard or maybe had not read. And that is that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God. Now, we can read about that in Deuteronomy chapter 23. And really, for the most part, without going into all the details, I put up Numbers 22 through 24. Might want to make note of that and go back and read through some of that. But these 2 groups are singled out because of what they did to these people as they were entering the promised land. And so you've got the situation there. You see Balaam's name. What do we most know Balaam for and his story? The talking donkey, right? But we're talking like, from the time they're reading this in Nehemiah, if you were to go all the way back to this, that's like, 1,000 years or so. Since that happened and went down. And so what's the good stuff by way of application? Especially if you read the rest of the chapter, you know that the rest of it is mainly bad. So let's try to pull some good out of these first 3 verses. And what do you have here? Okay. Yeah, and then on top of that, to take the next step, if you look at verse 3, they seem to do exactly what it is that they're hearing. And that's the same thing that we read back in chapter 8 with the Feast of Booths and them going back and doing all of that. So what's the application to us? Pretty easy, right? We make that pretty hard on ourselves, though, don't we? I think outside of that easy piece of application, I think what's more than that is, can you think of any excuses that they could have used here to not read and then do? Okay. All right, so yeah, we're actually going to I didn't think about that, but yeah, we're probably still in this scenario where there's some that maybe don't understand what they're reading, right? And we've seen that before. Good point. Anything else? Other excuses they might have used? Right. Yeah. Right. So things are different now. And that's not, that's a long time ago. We don't need to do that, right? Now, do we ever use that excuse today? You ever hear that excuse out there? Man, what's the point of this? This was written so long ago. How in the world can you tell me this has anything to do with today or tomorrow? Right? Do you hear that? You hear people say that? In the same way, they could have done that. What else? Is there anything else you can think of? Well, there's another problem. Go ahead. Okay. Okay. Okay, keep going. What do you mean? Explain yourself. Oh, eliminating these people. Oh, okay, gotcha. Okay, all right. Yeah, gotcha. Yep, and yep, yeah, yeah. It'd be hard in that context. Yeah, another one that maybe like let's when it comes to things like this that are very direct, right? Drew just said read and do. But sometimes we want to add an extra step in there. Read, no, let's talk about it first. And then I'll do what I want to do. Or let's do what man says to do. And that's not what we see happening here. So I don't know how aware we are or up to speed we are with the changing landscape of what's happening in the world. I know most of you are in the know, especially as it follows into some of these excuses. And I hope the elders wouldn't mind me saying this, but in the last elders meeting I was in, they spent about 30 to 45 minutes in discussion talking about this very thing and how we can be proactive in our approach of not making excuses so as to have those kind of things leak into what we do, but rather have this continue to be the read it and do it. And this be the guide and this be the lead in everything that we do. I think it's super important that these should be commended because they read something and they did it. So anyways, let me stop there. Do you have anything you want to add to these first 3 verses? Okay, so now with the positive thing out of the way, all we got next is a whole bunch of problems, and really 4 of them. And what's amazing is what Nehemiah comes back to. Like, he leaves up out of there, and without good leadership and all these things, like, amazing how fast it can go awry. So look at verse 4. It says, "Now before this, Eliashib, the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, and who was related to Tobiah," you've heard that name before, "prepared for Tobiah a large chamber where they had previously put the grain offering, the frankincense, the vessels, and the tithes of grain, wine, and oil, which were given by commandment to the Levites, singers, and gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests. While this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king, and after some time I asked leave of the king, and came to Jerusalem. And I then discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah, preparing for him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. And I was very angry, and I threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber. Then I gave orders, and they cleansed the chambers, and I brought back there the vessels of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense." So what's the problem? Or maybe the better question is, what is not the problem, right? No, seriously, what's the problem here? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know the exact relationship, but we did learn even earlier that it was said that that Nehemiah was hearing people speak well of Tobiah because of the relationship or because he was related. But, so you have Eliashib, who's a priest, a high priest, and then this guy comes in here into the house of God. So really, what is the problem? What is the no besides him letting him in? Yeah, him being there. Yeah, him being in there in the first place. Now, we've talked about this part, right? Because do you remember when all those threats were coming at Nehemiah, that Sanballat and Tobiah hired a guy to tell Nehemiah, hey, you run over here to the temple so you don't get killed. And do you remember what Nehemiah said? No, I'm not going to do that. I know that's not right of me to do. And now, all of a sudden, you got this guy, Tobiah, taking up residence right here. And I got to imagine it's semi-worse because he's been a thorn in the side of Nehemiah this entire time. He's been all the opposition. So, but I want you to see something else. Go to verse 9. I want you to notice that, you know, not only was just this large room prepared for him in verse 5, or chamber, but when Nehemiah cleans house, it isn't just one room. Look at verse 9. Did you notice or did you catch the plural, the chambers, the rooms, your version might read? Now, I'm not sure what to make of that, but found it pretty interesting. Like, hey, like we're going to totally fumigate this place. I don't even want Nehemiah's smell or his body odor catching, oh, what did I say? Nehemiah, Tobiah. I don't even want it leaking over into the next room. Like, we're cleaning house and we're going to set this back right. And I just can't help but to wonder what his face looked like as he came back and he sees all his junk thrown out and everything back to the way it should be. I think that's super cool. Doug? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, you're exactly right. Yeah, shouldn't have even been close, right? Drew? Yep. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. That's a pretty good word. I'll take it. Yeah. Well, he's done right here what he's tried to do all along, right? Um, yeah, and that's what he's done. So I think there's for sure, you know, just as we read this part, there's some application surrounding Nehemiah's response here, you know, and so what do you got by way of that? Because he's not happy. It actually says, I mean, this version we're reading from says that I was very angry, and he starts throwing things. Go ahead, Nate.
Nehemiah's response was that the desecration of the temple was similar to Christ's almost 5 centuries later,
Yep.
when he went in and cleared the temple.
All four of the Gospels recorded, right? What is happening is wrong. They know it's wrong. I know it's wrong. We're not fooling anybody. But I think what's interesting here about Nehemiah, we haven't seen this side. Almost everything else he does, he steps away and he plans and he's prayerful. But in this case, is that what you see? Hey guys, let me go away and pray about this. No. I mean, he handles business and does it right now. And Nate's right. A good contrast to that would be what Jesus does, right? All right, verse 10. So I also found out that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them, so that the Levites and the singers who did the work had fled each to his field. So I confronted the officials and said, "Why is the house of God forsaken?" And I gathered them together and set them in their stations. And then all Judah brought the tithe of the grain, wine, and oil into the storehouses. And I appointed as treasurers over the storehouses Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and Pedaiah of the Levites, and as their assistant Hanan, the son of Zakur, son of Mattaniah, for they were considered reliable. And their duty was to distribute to their brothers. Remember me, O my God. Verse 14 is more or less a prayer. Remember me, O my God, concerning this. Do not wipe out my good deeds that I've done for the house of my God and for his service. So, Drew has kind of already touched on what's going on here, is that they've gotten away from doing the very thing they should do. Now, I hope that you remember this oath that they made. Do you remember seeing this slide 2 weeks ago? And then I showed it to you again in review. How they doing with that promise and that oath? Not good, as we see what is going on here, and it doesn't hold up that long. And so, these people, these Levites and these singers are returning to their field, and why is that even a problem? Why is that a problem that they return to their field and they go work somewhere else? Because of this, right? They're not doing the very thing that they're there to do. And so, they have to go away in order to survive and in order to live. I guess, you could make the connection to today. If all support here dried up totally and completely, what would you suspect Jody and myself might do? You think we'd go get another job? Why would we do that? What? Yeah, like dinner. I gotta eat. I gotta live. I gotta survive. I got kids. The same thing could be said here, but that wouldn't even be the worst of it. So what is the worst of it? Okay. Yep. But yeah, so for the most part, what that means is that the people are not doing the very thing that they've been commanded to do. And so, that again, I don't even think that's the worst part. What the worst part is, you've got this group of people that are not doing the very thing that God said to do by way of giving. And so, no surprise here, what does Nehemiah do? This is not okay. This is not good. It's wrong. You're not listening to what God's saying. You're not doing it. And so, I can't help but to paint the picture that Nehemiah raised his voice a little bit. This is not a nice and sweet, guys, it's okay. I just don't see it going down that way. And then we see this prayer in verse 14. So any comments here, points of application, you want to make here? Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's the common thread throughout all of his reaction here, right? I think as we go back and we look at this slide, are there not times where we dabble inside the realm of neglecting the house of our God? That could be, any number of things by way of our attendance and being with the people, or working, or giving even. All these things, and we've pointed out so many times through this study of Nehemiah, we can talk and we can say all we want, but whatever you look at in this entire book of Nehemiah, it requires some action. And I just can't help but to think, I wonder how many times I know I'm wrong, and I know I've neglected something that I should do, and I come back to God and I'm praying to God, not that there's anything wrong with that, but I just wonder if sometimes he looks down and he says, Jed, I'm listening to you, buddy, but you have to get up off your knees and you got to do something about it. I think maybe sometimes we just miraculously think things are going to fix themselves, and there's action here, and that's what Nehemiah is pushing here. Like, man, we got to set this back right. This is wrong. Let's get it back right. And this is how we're going to do it. Anything else on this chunk that we just read? Mom? He's back. Yeah. 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 Right. Yeah, and then on top of that, whatever this time frame or time period was that he was gone, to be able to come back after that amount of time and to come back like that with, I'm assuming still the respect and still the, all the looking up to him for, who we've seen him to be all this time. Kind of cool. All right, verse 15. So in those days, I saw in Judah people treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in heaps of grain and loading them on donkeys, and also wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them on the day when they sold food. So let me stop here. Let's go right back to that oath again. Chapter 10 and verse 31. This is something they promised not to do. We talked about this, and I asked you guys, so what would this look like? So someone's coming up over the hill on the Sabbath day, ready to do business, and what would they say? No, we're closed. But now all of a sudden, here we are in chapter 13, and all of that has changed. They're right back to their old ways. So picking back up in verse 16. Tyrians also, who lived in the city, brought in fish and all kinds of goods and sold them on the Sabbath to the people in Judah and Jerusalem itself. Then I confronted the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this evil thing that you're doing, profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers act in this way, and did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? Now you're bringing more wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. As soon as it began to grow dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut and gave orders that they should not be open until after the Sabbath. And then I stationed some of my servants at the gates that no load might be brought in on the Sabbath day. Then the merchants and sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice. But I warned them and said to them, why do you lodge outside of the wall? If you do so again, I'm going to lay hands on you. From that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and come and guard the gates to keep the Sabbath day holy. Remember this also in my favor, O my God, and spare me according to the greatness of your steadfast love. So, we got in and of itself another issue, and that is keeping this day. And what does Nehemiah do to wake them up but close the gates? And so you got people sleeping outside. They've been trapped. They've been stuck out there because he's closed the gates, and he even stationed some gatekeepers, some guards, so that they don't cheat and try to sneak through the door, I guess. But I hope you're seeing this again, and let me backtrack on the screen to verses 17 and 18, is again this word of confrontation or anger we've seen. I mean, just time and time again. So in verse 8, you got him displeased and angry, and he throws out Tobiah's junk. Verse 11, the word confronted the officials or reprimanded them. And now what we got up here on the screen is another confrontation. Can't imagine that's a nice and sweet and loving confrontation. So what's the learn here? What do we take? Like, I need to go yelling and screaming my way through issues and problems, or what do we take of all this? Yeah. You sure? Yeah. Well, we talk an awful lot. I don't think this part can get lost. And like, I mean, if you're a parent, you know, I mean, I'm learning still, but I know that there are times where swift correction, or, you know, like, I guess righteous anger, we would call it, can show forth in order to uproot whatever that junk is that's going on. Most especially if you're doing the same thing over and over and over again, right? I mean, how much patience do you continue to have with your child who's done the very thing that you've asked them not to do for the third time, then the fifth time, then the 10th time, right? Wait, y'all are looking at me like you got more patience than me. Okay, I know the way you used to beat us? Is that what you? No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
You go to verse 21.
Yeah. Yeah, verse 21, lay hands on them. So, no, I know the way I was raised, and I know that, you know, oftentimes you got to number 3 after being told 3 times, and it was coming out looking like this. Sorry. All right, so like again, I can't imagine Nehemiah coming in and saying it'll be fine, it'll be okay, and babying our way through something like this. But as bad as we think it may be so far, like you've not seen anything yet, because here's what comes next. So verse 23. We read, in those days also I saw the Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. So what's the problem? Going against the word, going against God's word, and then also remember going against their oath, the promise, the same thing. So it's no different. And so, like, we've talked about that. And remember, the whole point of not doing this was really kind of a dilution of their faith, right? And we're going to read more about that here in just a minute with the language and bringing in all these other things. But look at the next verse, verse 24. And so half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, but only the language of each people. So why is that a problem? Okay, yeah, they can't read. They wouldn't understand if it's being spoken. Like, that's a major problem. Now, I know I've brought up, you know, the whole idea of me used to be an intensive reading teacher, and every now and then they would take a Spanish-speaking kid that, like, I mean, just put him right in my classroom. Now, I mean, they have tools in place, they have support in place to help those kids, but you want to guess how much I was able to get across to that kid? I don't speak Spanish. I don't know any Spanish. I know my times tables, Brandon, but no, but like, I mean, that's super hard. I wouldn't expect that kid to learn a whole lot. And that's kind of what we got going on. And so add on top of that in the context here, that what we have is that, like, these were people that were also a part of the opposition as you go all the way back to chapter 4. So, you know, it wasn't just the ones we heard about that needed to be separated, but you go all the way back here and they're mentioned there. So that's a problem as well. All right, look at verse 25 before we run out of time. Let me read through the rest. And I confronted them and cursed them and beat some of them and pulled out their hair. And I made them take an oath, another oath, in the name of God, saying, you shall not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons or for yourselves. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin on account of such women? Among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was beloved by his God. And God made him king over Israel. Nevertheless, foreign women made even him to sin. Shall we then listen to you and do all this great evil and act treacherously against our God by marrying foreign women? And one of the sons of Jehoiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, was the son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite. Therefore I chased him from me. I'd like to see that. Guess he had wheels. Remember them, oh my God, because they have desecrated the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. Thus I cleansed them from everything foreign, and I established the duties of the priests and Levites, each in his work, and I provided for the wood offering at appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, oh my God, for good. So it's kind of curious right here. Like last week, we made the observation that, really in the celebration and the dedication of the wall, that the people probably would not have shown the joy that they showed without who also showing it? Nehemiah. And now here what you have is a not so happy Nehemiah. So how though, I guess really here's the question, how can the way in which he's handling these things be encouraging? Okay? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Swift. Yeah. Right. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So, I think you may have to go back to probably time when you were not yet an adult to have felt this way. But when you're called out by someone else for doing something that's wrong, how does it initially feel? Does it feel encouraging? Okay, so it's actually discouraging, but when it comes across this way, what does it also do? I mean, what's that? Go ahead. Yeah, it makes you pay attention, right? I mean, the serious nature, Drew used the word serious, but the serious nature of what's happening now comes to the top or rises to the top before I do it. And so, I think sometimes like it's just who we are now. I don't like confrontation. You don't like confrontation. Nobody really likes confrontation. But sometimes, is it necessary when someone is wrong? Now, is that just a Nehemiah thing? Okay. So why is that not just a Nehemiah thing?
I've been rebuked a couple times already and stuff, and he was angry then, obviously did things. But this time here, you needed an attention get.
Right.
You needed to grab him and say, listen,
Yeah. This is for
they
real.
got to start thinking, wow,
Yeah.
this might be the last time I get warned.
Yeah. Yeah. Do we have any examples in the New Testament of, this kind of thing? Someone's doing the very thing they shouldn't be, or even they've done it to you. And what are we supposed to do? Go to them, right? Yeah, Matthew chapter 18, right? Now, I'm not saying that needs to be me pulling your hair out or me coming upside your head, but at the same time, that is a part of what this is and who we're supposed to be, is it not? That, man, I would hope that it would be not just my parents that would come to me and tell me, hey, Jed, I saw you this or that. I mean, Is that not a part of being close to people? Is being able to tell them, hey, you're wrong. Just as much are the times that we talk about more that are, I love you, and I hug you, and I shake your hand, and we have a smile on our face. But there's also the other side of it. And I think that's a lot of what we learned through Nehemiah, is that can be effective as well. All right, so let me remind you here as we run out of time, you guys don't give me anything, then you're in trouble. So if you got stuff, again, text it, email it, write it, stick it on my desk. You got things you want cleared up or talked about a little more. Otherwise, we'll just kind of walk through and review everything that we've read, because it's been 3 months.